Good afternoon and welcome to this further evidence session of the Joint Committee on the Draft Online Safety Bill. Today we're pleased to welcome Frances Haugen to give evidence to the committee. Frances, we're delighted that you've been able to make this trip to be in London and give evidence to us in person, and also respect the personal decision you've taken to speak out on these matters with all the risks incumbent with speaking out against a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I'd just like to ask you first off about some of the statistics Facebook uses itself to describe its performance. In its transparency reporting, it says that it removes 97% of hate speech that it finds on the platform, but the documents that you've published suggest that its AI only actually finds 2 to 3% of the hate speech that's there. Does that mean that Facebook's transparency reports, without any context around those numbers, are essentially meaningless?
I think it's important to, there's a pattern of behavior at Facebook, which is they are very good at dancing with data. That if you go and read that transparency report, the fraction that they're presenting is not total hate speech caught divided by total hate speech that exists, which is what you might expect given what they said. The fraction that they are actually presenting is the stuff that robots got divided by stuff robots got plus what humans reported and we took down. And it's true that 97% or something of what they take down happens because of their robots. But that's not actually the question we want answered. The question we want answered is, did you take the hate speech down? And the number I've seen is like 3 to 5%, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some variation within the documents.
I think it's a really important point, as essentially what we're looking at here is the creation of an independent regulator for the tech sector, that not only do we need answers, but we need to know what the right questions are as well, because the official statistics are so misleading.
Part of why I came forward is I know that I have a specific set of expertise. Like, I've worked at 4 social networks. I am an algorithmic specialist, so I worked on search quality at Google. I ran ranking for the new home feed on Pinterest. I have an understanding of how AI can unintentionally behave. Facebook never set out to prioritize polarizing divisive content. It just happened to be a side effect of choices they did make. Part of why I came forward is that I am extremely, extremely worried about the condition of our societies, our condition of the global South, and the interaction of the choices Facebook has made and how it plays out more broadly. So things I'm specifically worried about are engagement-based ranking, which Facebook has said before. Mark Zuckerberg put out a white paper in 2018 saying engagement-based ranking is dangerous unless the AI can take out the bad things. And as you saw, they're getting 3 to 5% of things like hate speech. They're getting 0.8% of violence inciting content. Engagement-based ranking prioritizes that kind of extreme content. I'm deeply concerned about their underinvestment in non-English languages and how they mislead the public that they are supporting them. So Facebook says things like, we support 50 languages, when in reality, most of those languages get a tiny fraction of the safety systems that English gets. Also, I don't think this is widely known, UK English is sufficiently different that I would be unsurprised if the safety systems that they developed primarily for American English were actually under-enforcing in the UK. I wouldn't be unsurprised at that. And Facebook should have to disclose dialectical differences. I'm deeply concerned about the false choices that Facebook presents. They routinely try to reduce the discussion to things like, you can either have transparency or privacy. Which do you want to have? Or you can, if you want safety, you have to have censorship. When in reality, they have lots of non-content-based choices that would sliver off a half percentage point of growth, a percentage point of growth. And Facebook is unwilling to give up those slivers for our safety. And I came forward now because now is the most critical time to act. When we see something like an oil spill, that oil spill doesn't make it harder for society to regulate oil companies. But right now, the failures of Facebook are making it harder for us to regulate Facebook.
So on those failures, looking at the way the platform is moderated today, do you think unless there is change, do you think it makes it more likely that we will see events like the insurrection in Washington on the 6th of January this year, more violent acts that have been driven by Facebook systems? Do you think it's more likely we will see more of those events as things stand today?
I have no doubt that the events we're seeing around the world, things like Myanmar and Ethiopia, those are the opening chapters, because engagement-based ranking does two things. One, it prioritizes and amplifies divisive, polarizing, extreme content, and two, it concentrates it. And so if Facebook comes back and says, only a tiny sliver of content on our platform is hate, or only a tiny sliver is violence, one, they can't detect it very well, so I don't know if I trust those numbers. But two, it gets hyper-concentrated in 5% of the population. And you only need 3% of the population on the streets to have a revolution, and that's dangerous.
I want to ask you a bit about that hyper-concentration,
Sure.
and particularly an area that you worked on in particular, and that's Facebook groups. I remember being told several years ago by a Facebook executive that the only way you could drive content through the platform is advertising. I think we see that is not true, and groups are increasingly used to shape that experience. We talk a lot about the impact of algorithmic-based recommendation tools like Newsfeed. To what extent do you think groups are shaping the experience for many people on Facebook?
Groups play a huge and critical role in driving the experience on Facebook. When I worked on civic misinformation, this is based on recollection, I don't have a document, but I believe it was something like 60% of the content in the newsfeed was from groups. I think a thing that's important for this group to know is that Facebook has been trying to extend the number of sessions, get you to consume longer sessions, more content. And the only way they can do that is by multiplying the content that already exists on the platform. And the way they do that is with things like groups and reshares. So if I put one post into a 500,000 person group, that can go out to 500,000 people. And when combined with engagement-based ranking, that group might produce 500, 1,000 pieces of content a day, but only 3 get delivered. And if your algorithm is biased towards extreme, polarizing, divisive content, it's like viral variants. Those giant groups are producing lots and lots of pieces of content, and only the ones most likely to spread are the ones that go out.
It was reported, I think, last year by the Wall Street Journal that 60% of people that joined Facebook groups that shared extremist content and promoted extremist content did so at Facebook's active recommendation. So this is clearly something Facebook is researching. What action is Facebook taking about groups that share extremist content?
I don't know the exact actions that have been taken in the last 6 months, a year. Actions regarding extremist groups being recommended actively to users, promoted to users, is a thing that Facebook shouldn't be able to just say, this is a hard problem, we're working on it. They should have to articulate, here's our 5-point plan, and here's the data that would allow you to hold us accountable, because Facebook acting in a non-transparent, unaccountable way will just lead to more tragedies.
Do you think that 5-point plan exists?
I don't know if they have a 5-point plan.
Or any plan?
I don't know. I didn't work on that.
Okay. But I mean, to what extent should we be considering groups, or should a regulator, UK regulator, be asking these questions about Facebook groups? From what you're saying, they are a significant driver of engagement, and if engagement is part of the problem, the way Facebook have designed it, then groups must be a big part of that too.
Groups. Part of what is dangerous about groups is that we talk about sometimes this idea of is this an individual problem or is this a societal problem? One of the things that happens in aggregate is the algorithms take people who have very mainstream interests and they push them towards extreme interests. You can be someone center-left and you'll get pushed to radical left. You can be center-right, you'll get pushed to radical right. You can be looking for healthy recipes, you'll get pushed to anorexia content. There are examples in Facebook's research of all this. One of the things that happens with groups and with networks of groups is that people see echo chambers that create social norms. So if I'm in a group that has lots of COVID misinformation, and I see over and over again that if someone gives COVID vaccine, things they encourage people to get vaccinated, they get completely pounced upon. They get torn apart. I learn that certain ideas are acceptable and unacceptable. When that context is around hate, now you see a normalization of hate, a normalization of dehumanizing others, and that's what leads to violent incidents.
I mean, many people would say that groups, particularly large groups, and some of these groups have hundreds of thousands of members in them,
Millions.
Yeah, millions. They should be much easier for the platform to moderate because people are gathering in a common place.
I strongly recommend that above a certain size group, they should be required to provide their own moderators and moderate every post. This would naturally, in a content agnostic way, regulate the impact of those large groups. Because if that group is actually valuable enough, they will have no trouble recruiting volunteers. But if that group is just an amplification point, like we see foreign information operations using groups like this and virality hacking, that's the practice of borrowing viral content from other places to build a group. We see these places as being, if you want to launch an advertising campaign with misinformation in it, we at least have a credit card to track you back. If you want to start a group and invite 1,000 people every day, like the limit is, I think, 2,200 people you can invite every day, you can build out that group and your content will land in their newsfeed for a month. And if they engage with any of it, it'll be considered a follow. And so things like that make them very, very dangerous, and they drive outsized impact on the platform.
I mean, from what you say, if a bad actor or agency wanted to influence what a group of people on Facebook would see, you'd probably set up Facebook groups to do that more than you would Facebook pages and run advertising.
And that is definitely a strategy that's currently used by information operations. Another one that's used, which I think is quite dangerous, is you can create a new account and within 5 minutes go post into a 1 million person group, right? There's no accountability, there's no trace, right? You can find a group to target any interest you want to. Very, very fine grained. Even if you removed micro-targeting from ads, people would micro-target via groups.
And again, I mean, what do you think the company's strategy is for dealing with this? Because again, there were changes made to Facebook groups, I think in 2017, 2018, to create more of a community experience, I think Mark Zuckerberg said, which was good for engagement. But it would seem similar to changes to the way newsfeed works in terms of the content that it prefers and favors. These are reforms the company have put in place that have been good for engagement, but have been terrible for harm.
I think there's we need to move away from having binary choices. There's a huge continuum of options that exist. Coming in and saying, hey, groups that are under 1,000 people are wonderful. They create community, they create solidarity, they help with people with connection. If you get above a certain size, maybe 10,000 people, like you need to start moderating that group, because that alone, that naturally rate limits it. And the thing that we need to think about is, where do we add selective friction to these systems so that they are safe in every language? You don't need the AIs to find the bad content.
In your experience, is Facebook testing its systems all the time? Does Facebook experiment with the way its systems work around how you can increase engagement? And obviously, in terms of content on the newsfeed, we know it experimented around the election time around the sort of news that should be favored. So how does Facebook work in experimenting with its tools?
Facebook is continuously running many experiments in parallel on little slices of the data that they have. I'm a strong proponent that Facebook should have to publish a feed of all the experiments they're running. They don't have to tell us what the experiment is, just an ID. And even just seeing the results data would allow us to establish patterns of behavior. Because the real thing we're seeing here is Facebook accepting little tiny additions of harm, like when they weigh off how much harm is worth how much growth for us. Right now, we can't benchmark and say, oh, you're running all these experiments. Are you acting in the public good? But if we had that data, we could see patterns of behavior and see whether or not trends are occurring.
You worked in the civic integrity team at Facebook. So if you saw something that was concerning you, who would you report to?
This is a huge weak spot. If I drove a bus in the United States, there would be a phone number in my break room that I could call that would say, did you see something that endangered public safety? Call this number. Someone will take you seriously and listen to you in like the Department of Transportation. When I worked on counter-espionage, I saw things where I was concerned about national security, and I had no idea how to escalate those because I didn't have faith in my chain of command at that point. Like, they had dissolved civic integrity. I didn't see that they would take that seriously, and we were told just to accept under-resourcing.
But, I mean, in theory, you would report to your line manager, and would it be then up to them whether they chose to escalate that?
And I flagged repeatedly when I worked on civic integrity that I felt that critical teams were understaffed, and I was told at Facebook we accomplish unimaginable things with far fewer resources than anyone would think possible. There is a culture that lionizes kind of a startup ethic that is, in my opinion, irresponsible, right? The idea that, the person who can figure out how to move the metric by cutting the most corners is good. And the reality is, it doesn't matter if Facebook is spending $14 billion on safety a year. If they should be spending $25 billion or $35 billion, that's the real question. And right now, there's no incentives internally that if you make noise saying we need more help, like you will not get rallied around for help because everyone is underwater.
In many organisations that ultimately fail, I think that sort of culture exists. There's a culture where there's no external audit and people within inside the organisation don't share problems with the people at the top. What do you think people like Mark Zuckerberg know about these things?
I think it's important that all facts are viewed through a lens of interpretation. And there is a pattern across a lot of the people who run the company or senior leaders, which is this may be the only job they've ever had, right? Like Mark came in when he was 19, and he's still the CEO. There's a lot of other people who are VPs or directors who this is the only job they've ever had. And so there is a lack of, the people who have been promoted were the people who, could focus on the goals they were given, and not necessarily the ones that asked questions around public safety. And I think there's a real thing that people are exposed to data, and then they say, look at all the good we're doing. Like, yes, that's true, but like we didn't invent hate. We didn't invent ethnic violence. And that's not the question. The question is, what is Facebook doing to amplify or expand hate? What is it doing to amplify or expand ethnic violence?
You're right. I mean, Facebook didn't invent hate, but do you think it's making hate worse?
Unquestionably, it's making hate worse.
Thank you. Joining us remotely, Jim Knight.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Francis, for coming and talking to us. First of all, just on some of that last fascinating discussion that you were having, if you talked about if you were calling out for help, you wouldn't necessarily get the resource. Would the same be true if you were working in PR or legal within Facebook?
I have never worked in PR or communications, so I'm not sure. I do know that there is. I was shocked to hear recently that Facebook wants to double down on the metaverse, and that they're going to hire 10,000 engineers in Europe to work on the metaverse. Because I was like, wow, do you know what we could have done with safety if we'd had 10,000 more engineers? It would have been amazing. I think there is a view inside the company that safety is a cost center. It's not a growth center, which I think is very short term in thinking. Because Facebook's own research has shown that when people have worse integrity experiences on the site, they are less likely to retain. I think regulation could actually be good for Facebook's long-term success, because it would force Facebook back into a place where it was more pleasant to be on Facebook, and that could be good for the long-term growth of the company.
Thank you. And then let me go back also to the discussion about Facebook groups, by which we're essentially talking about private groups, clearly. If you were asked to be the regulator of a platform like Facebook, how do you get the transparency about what's going on in private groups, given that they're private?
I think there's a real bar. Like, we need to have a conversation as society around how many people, after a certain number of people have seen something, is it truly private, right? Is that number 10,000? Is it 25,000? Is it really private at that point? Because I think there's an argument that Facebook will make, which is that, there might be a sensitive group, which someone might post into, and we wouldn't want to share that even if 25,000 people saw it, which I think is actually more dangerous, right? That if people are lulled into a sense of safety, that no one's going to see their hate speech, or no one's going to see maybe a more sensitive thing, like maybe they haven't come out yet, right? That is dangerous because those spaces are not safe, right? When 100,000 people see something, you don't know who saw it and what they might do. So I'm a big proponent of both Google and Twitter are radically more transparent than Facebook, right? People every day download the search results on Google and analyze them. And people publish papers. And because Google knows this happens, they staff software engineers who work on search quality to write blog posts. Twitter knows that 10% of all the public tweets end up going out on their fire hose. And people analyze those and do things like find information operation networks. And because Twitter knows someone is watching, they behave better. I think in the case of Facebook, and even with private groups, there should be some bar above which we say, enough people have seen this, it's not private. And we should have a fire hose just like Twitter, because if we want to catch national security threats like information operations, we need to have not just the people at Facebook looking at it, we need to have 10,000 researchers looking at it. And I think in addition to that, we'd have accountability on things like algorithmic bias, or understanding whether or not our children are safe.
That's really helpful. And just on Twitter and algorithmic bias, they published a report on Friday suggesting there was an algorithmic bias politically. Do you think that is unique to Twitter, or would you say that would also be the case in Facebook? Is that something implicit in the way that these algorithms and these platforms with all of their algorithms are designed to optimize clicks, and therefore there's something about certain types of political content that makes it more extreme, that is endemic to all of these social media companies?
I am not aware of any research that demonstrates a political bias on Facebook. I am familiar with lots of research that says the way engagement-based ranking was designed, so Facebook calls it meaningful social interactions, though meaningful could have been hate speech or bullying up until November 2020, and it would still be considered meaningful. So let's call it social interaction ranking. I've seen lots of research that says that kind of ranking, engagement-based ranking, prioritizes polarizing, extreme, divisive content. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right, it pushes you to the extremes, and it fans hate, right? Anger and hate is the easiest way to grow on Facebook. There's something called virality hacking, where you figure out all the tricks on how to optimize Facebook. And good actors, good publishers, are already publishing all the content they can do. But bad actors have an incentive to play the algorithm, and they figure out all the ways to optimize Facebook. And so the current system is biased towards bad actors and biased towards people who push people to the extremes.
Thank you. And then currently we have a draft bill which is focusing on individual harm rather than societal harm. Given the work that you've done around democracy as part of your work at Facebook, do you think that it is a mistake to omit societal harm?
I think it is a grave danger to democracy and societies around the world to omit societal harm. To give like a core part of why I came forward was I looked at the consequences of choices Facebook was making, and I looked at things like the global south. And I believe situations like Ethiopia are just part of the opening chapters of a novel that is going to be horrific to read. Right? We have to care about societal harm, not just for the global south, but our own societies. Because like I said before, when an oil spill happens, it doesn't make it harder for us to regulate oil companies. But right now, Facebook is closing the door on us being able to act. Like, we have a slight window of time to regain people control over AI. We have to take advantage of this moment.
And my final question, and thank you, is undoubtedly, just because you're a digital company, you'll have looked at user journeys and analysed in a lot of detail the data around how different user journeys work. Is there any relationship between paid-for advertising and then moving into some of these dangerous private groups, possibly then being moved into messaging services, into encrypted messaging? Are there user journeys like that we should also be concerned about, particularly given that paid-for advertising is currently excluded from this bill?
I am extremely concerned about paid-for advertising being excluded because engagement-based ranking impacts ads as much as it impacts organic content. I'll give you an example. Ads are priced partially based on the likelihood that people like them, reshare them, do other things to interact with them, click through on a link. An ad that gets more engagement is a cheaper ad. We have seen that over and over again in Facebook's research, it is easier to provoke people to anger than to empathy or compassion, and so we are literally subsidizing hate on these platforms. It is cheaper substantially to run an angry, hateful, divisive ad than it is to run a compassionate, empathetic ad. And I think there is a need for things, even discussing disclosures of what rates like people are paying for ads, having full transparency on the ad stream, and understanding what are those biases that come in how ads are targeted. In terms of user journeys from ads to extreme groups, I don't have documents regarding that, but I can imagine it happening.
Beeben Kidron.
Hi, thank you, Francis, and thank you really very much for being here and taking a personal risk to be here. We are grateful. I really wanted to ask a number of questions that sort of speak to the fact that this system is entirely engineered for a particular outcome. And maybe you could start by telling us, what is Facebook optimized for?
I think a thing that is not necessarily obvious to us as consumers of Facebook is that Facebook is actually a two-sided marketplace. It is about producers in addition to being about consumers. Like, you can't consume content on Facebook without getting someone to produce it. Facebook switched over to engagement-based ranking. They said, the reason we're doing this is we believe it's important for people to interact with each other. We don't want people to mindlessly scroll. But a large part of what was disclosed in the documents was that a large factor that motivated this change was that people were producing less content. Facebook has run things called producer-side experiments, where they artificially give people more distribution to see what is the impact on your future behavior of getting more likes, more reshares, because they know if you get those little hits of dopamine, you're more likely to produce more content. And so right now, Facebook has said repeatedly, it's not in our business interest to optimize for hate. It's not in our business interest to give people bad experiences. But it is in Facebook's interest to make sure the content production wheel keeps turning, because you won't look at ads if your feed doesn't keep you on the site. And Facebook has accepted the costs of engagement-based ranking because it allows that wheel to keep turning.
So that actually leads beautifully to my next question, which is, I was really struck not so much by the harms, because in a funny way, they just gave evidence to what a lot of people have been saying for a long time and a lot of people have been experiencing. But what was super interesting was that again and again, the documents show that Facebook employees were saying, oh, you could do this, you could do that. And I think that a lot of people don't understand what you could do. So I'd really love you to say to the committee, unpack a little bit, what were Facebook employees saying we could do about provide the body image issues on Instagram? What were they saying about ethnic violence, and what were they saying about the democratic harms that you were just referring to?
I have been mischaracterized repeatedly in certain parts of the internet that I'm here as like a plant to get more censorship. One of the things that I saw over and over again in the docs was that there are lots and lots of solutions that don't involve picking good and bad ideas. They're about designing the platform for safety, slowing the platform down, and that when you give people more content from their family and friends, you get for free less hateful, divisive content. You get less misinformation. Because the biggest part that's driving misinformation is these hyper-distribution nodes, these groups where it goes out to 500,000 people. Some examples of non-content-based interventions are things like, let's imagine Alice posts something, and Bob reshares it, and Carol reshares it, and now it lands in Dan's newsfeed. If Dan had to copy and paste that to continue to share it, so his share button was grayed out, that's a 2-hop reshare chain. That has the same impact as the entire third-party fact-checking system, only it's going to work in the global south. It doesn't require us to have a language-by-language system. It just slows the platform down. Moving to systems that are human-scaled instead of having AI tell us where to focus is the safest way to design social media. And I want to remind people, we liked social media before we had an algorithmic feed. And Facebook said, if you move to a chronological feed, you won't like it. And it's true, with groups that are 500,000 people, where it's just like a spraying content at people, you're not going to like it. But Facebook has choices that it could do in different ways. It could have groups that were designed like these things called Discord servers, where it's all chronological, but people break out into different rooms as it gets too crowded. That's a human intervention, a human scale solution, not an AI-driven solution. And so slowing the platform down, content agnostic strategies, human scale solutions, that's the direction we need to go.
Why don't they do it?
So each one of these interventions, so in the case of reshares, there are some countries in the world where 35% of all the content in the newsfeed is a reshare. And the reason why Facebook doesn't, crack down on reshares or do friction on them at least, is because they don't want to lose that growth. They don't want 1% shorter sessions, because that's also 1% less revenue. And so Facebook has been unwilling to accept even little slivers of profit being sacrificed for safety. And that's not acceptable.
And I wanted to ask you in particular about what a break glass measure is, if you would tell us.
Facebook's current security strategy, safety strategy, is that it knows engagement-based ranking is dangerous, but the AI is going to pick out the bad things. But sometimes the heat in a country gets hotter and hotter and hotter. It might be a place like Myanmar that didn't have any misinformation classifiers, or like labeling systems, no hate speech labeling classifying systems, because their language wasn't spoken by enough people. They allow the temperature in these countries to get hotter and hotter and hotter. And when the pot starts boiling over, they're like, oh no, we need to break the glass. We need to slow the platform down. And Facebook has a strategy of only when crisis has begun, it slows the platform down. instead of watching as the temperature gets hotter and making the platform safer as that happens. So that's what break glass measures are.
Okay, so I guess why I'm asking these questions is if you could slow it down, make the groups smaller, have break glass as a norm rather than in emergency. These are all really safety by design strategies. These are all just saying, you know, make your product fit for purpose. Can you just say if you think that those could be mandatory in the bill that we're looking at?
Facebook right now has characterized the reason why they turned off their break the glass measures after the US 2020 election was because they don't believe in censorship. These measures had largely nothing to do with content. There were questions around how much do you amplify a live video? Do you give it a 600x multiplier or a 60x multiplier? Little questions where Facebook optimized their settings for growth over safety. And I think there's a real thing that we need to think about safety by design first. And Facebook have to demonstrate that they have assessed the risks. They must be mandated to assess the risks. And we need to specify how good is that risk assessment, because Facebook will give you a bad one if they can. And we need to mandate that they have to articulate solutions, because Facebook is not articulating what's the 5-point plan to solve these things.
I also want to raise the issue of whitelisting, because a lot of the bill actually talks about terms and conditions, them being very clear, and then upholding terms and conditions and having a regulatory sort of relationship to upholding them. But what about whitelisting, where some people are exempt from terms and conditions? Can you give us your view on that?
So for those who are not familiar with the reporting by the Wall Street Journal, there's a program called Crosscheck. So Crosscheck was a system where about 5 million people around the world, I think it's maybe 5.7 million, were given special privileges that allowed them to skip the line, if you will, for safety systems, right? So the majority of safety systems inside of Facebook didn't have enough staffing to actually manually review. Facebook claimed this is just about a second check, about making sure the rules are applied correctly. And because Facebook was unwilling to invest enough people to do that second check, they just let people through. And so I think there's a real thing of, unless we have more avenues to understand what's going on inside the company, like, for example, imagine if Facebook was required to publish its research on a 1-year lag, right? If they have tens of billions of dollars of profit, they can afford to solve problems on a 1-year lag, right? We should be able to know that systems like this exist because no one knew how bad the system was, because Facebook lied to their own oversight board about it.
I think the last area I really want to think about is, you know, obviously all the documents you bring come from Facebook, but we can't really regulate for this company in this moment. We have to look at the sector as a whole, and we have to look into the future. And I just wonder whether you have any advice for that, because we're not trying to kill Facebook, we're trying to make the digital world better and safer for its users.
Engagement-based ranking is a problem across all sites, right? All sites are going to be, it's easier to provoke humans to anger. Engagement-based ranking figures out our vulnerabilities and panders to those things. I think having mandatory risk assessments and mandatory remediation strategies, we need ways to hold these companies accountable, is critical, because companies are going to evolve. They're going to figure out how to sidestep things. And we need to make sure that we have a process that is flexible and can evolve with the companies over time.
Fantastic. And finally, really, just, you know, do you think that the scope of the bill, it's user to user and search, do you think that's a wise move, or should we be looking for some systemic solutions for the sector more broadly?
User to user and search. That's a great question. I think any platform that has a reach of more than a couple million people, the public has a right to understand how that is impacting society, because we're entering an age where technology is accelerating faster and faster, right? Democratic processes take time if they're done well. And we need to be able to think about how will we know when the next danger is looming. Because, for example, in my case, because Facebook is a public company, I could file with the SEC for whistleblower protections. If I had worked at TikTok, which is growing very, very fast, that's a private company, and I wouldn't have had any avenue to be a whistleblower. And so I think there is a real thing of thinking about any tech company that has a large societal impact, we need to be thinking about how do we get data out of that company, because, for example, you can't take a college class today to understand the integrity systems inside of Facebook. The only people who understand it are people inside of Facebook. And so thinking systematically about, for large tech companies, how do we get the information that we need to make good decisions is vital.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jen.
You mentioned the Oversight Board. I know you're going to be meeting with the Oversight Board. They themselves don't have access to the sort of information you've been publishing or the information you've been discussing. I mean, do you think the Oversight Board should insist on that transparency or disband itself?
I always reject binary choices. I'm not an A or B person. I love C and D. I think there is a great opportunity for the Oversight Board to experiment with what is its bounds. You know, this is a defining moment for the Oversight Board. What relationship does it want to have with Facebook? And I think I hope the Oversight Board takes this moment to step up and demand a relationship that has more transparency, because they should ask the question, why was Facebook able to lie to them in this way? What enabled that? Because if Facebook can come in there and just actively mislead the Oversight Board, which is what they did, I don't know what the purpose of the Oversight Board is.
More of a hindsight board than an oversight board, isn't it? Tim Clement-Jones.
Francis, hello. You've been very eloquent about the impact of the algorithm. You've talked about ranking, pushing extreme content, the amplification of that sort of content, an addiction driver, I think you've used the phrase. And this follows on really from talking about the Oversight Board or a regulator over here, or indeed trying to construct a safety by design regime. What do we need to know about the algorithm, and how do we get that, basically? Should it be about the output of an algorithm, or should we be actually inspecting the entrails for a code? When we talk about transparency, it's very easy just to say, oh, we need to be much more transparent about the operation of these algorithms. But what does that really mean?
I think it's always important to think about Facebook as a concert of algorithms. There are many different algorithmic systems, and they work in different ways. Some are amplification systems, some are downregulation systems. And understanding how all those parts work and how they work together is important. So I'll give you an example. Facebook has said engagement-based ranking is dangerous unless you have this AI that's going to pick out the extreme content. Facebook has never published which languages are supported and which integrity systems are supported in those languages. Because of this, they are actively misleading the speakers of most large languages in the world by saying, we support 50 languages, but most of those countries have a fraction of the safety systems that English have. When we say, how does the algorithm work, we need to be thinking about what is the experience of the algorithm for lots of individual populations. Because the experience of Facebook's newsfeed algorithm in a place that doesn't have integrity systems on is very different than, say, the experience in Menlo Park. And so I think some of the things that need to happen are, there are ways of doing privacy-sensitive disclosures of, we call it segmentation. So imagine if you divided the United States up into 600 communities based on what pages and groups people interact with, their interests. You don't need to say this group is, 35 to 40-year-old white women who live in the South. You don't need to say that. You can have a number on that cluster, but understanding, are some groups disproportionately getting COVID misinfo? Right now, 4% of those segments are getting 80% of all the misinfo. We didn't know that until my disclosure. For hate speech, it's the same way. For violence incitement, it's the same way. And so when we say, do we understand the algorithm, we should really be asking, do we understand the experiences of the algorithm? And that if Facebook gives you aggregate data, it will likely hide how dangerous the systems are, because the experience of the 95th percentile for every single integrity harm is radically different, or the 99th percentile is even more radically different than the median experience. And I want to be really clear, the people who go and commit acts of violence those are people who get hyper-exposed to this dangerous content. And so we need to be able to break out by those extreme experiences.
That's really interesting. I mean, do you think that that is practical for Facebook to produce? Would they need to have further research, or have they got ready access to that kind of information?
You could produce that information today, right? So the segmentation systems exist. That was one of the projects that I founded when I was at Facebook. That segmentation has been used since for different problem areas like COVID misinformation. And they already produce many of these integrity statistics. So part of what's extremely important about Facebook should have to publish which integrity systems exist and in which languages is right now, let's imagine we are looking at self-harm content for teenagers. Let's imagine we came in and said, we want to understand how is self-harm concentrated across these segments. Facebook's most recent position, according to a governmental source we talked to, was that they said, we don't track self-harm content. We don't know who's overexposed. If they were forced to publish what integrity systems exist, we could say, wait, why don't you have a self-harm classifier? You need to have one so we can answer this question of, is the self-harm content focused on 5% of the population? Because we can answer that question if we have the data.
And we should wrap that into a risk assessment that we
Yes.
require to be delivered to us, basically.
If I were writing standards on risk assessments, a mandatory provision I would put in there is you need to do segmented analysis because the median experience on Facebook is a pretty good experience. The real danger is that 20% of the population has a horrible experience or an experience that is dangerous.
Is that the core of what we would need by way of information from Facebook or other platforms? Or is there other information about data? Or, I mean, what else do we need to be really effective in risk assessment?
I think there's an opportunity. Imagine if for each of those integrity systems, Facebook had to show you a sampling of content at different scores, right? We would be able to come in there. So a problem that I'm really concerned about is that Facebook has trouble differentiating but in many languages, the difference between terrorism content and counterterrorism content. So think about the role of counterterrorism content in society. It's how people make society safer. Because Facebook's AIs don't work very well, for the language that was in question, I believe it was an Arabic dialect, 76% of the counterterrorism content was getting labeled as terrorism. If Facebook had to disclose content at different scores, we could go and check and say, oh, interesting, this is where your systems are weak and for which languages, because each language performs differently. I think there is a real importance for if there were a fire hose for Facebook and Facebook had to disclose what the scoring parameters were, I guarantee you researchers would develop techniques for understanding the roles of those scores and amplifying which kinds of content.
John Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and thank you so much for joining us. You might be interested to know that you're trending on Twitter.
Right now?
So people are listening.
Yeah.
I thought the most chilling sentence that you've come out with so far this afternoon, and I wrote it down, anger and hate is the easiest way to grow on Facebook. I mean, that's shocking, isn't it? What a horrendous insight into contemporary society on social media that should be the case.
One report from Facebook demonstrates how there's different kinds of feedback cycles that are all playing in concert. So it said, when you look at the hostility of a comment thread, so let's look at a single publisher at a time and take all the content on Facebook and look at the average hostility of that comment thread. The more hostile the comment thread, the more likely a click will go out to that publisher, right? Anger incites traffic outwards, which means profit. We also see that people who want to grow really fast, they do that technique of harvesting viral content from other groups and spreading into their own pages, into their groups, and they bias towards stuff that gets an emotional reaction. And the easiest emotional reaction to get is anger, and psychology research has shown this for decades.
So those of us who are adults or aspiring adults, like members of the committee, will find that hard enough to deal with. But for children, this is particularly challenging, isn't it? And I'd like to follow up on some of Baroness Kidron's very good questions, specifically on harm to children. Perhaps you could tell us, for people who don't know, what percentage of British teenagers can trace, for those who feel like this, their desire to kill themselves back, I can't even believe I'm saying that sentence, but back to Instagram.
I don't remember the exact statistic. I think it was around 12%.
It's
13. Or?
It's exactly that.
Yeah.
And body image is also made much worse, isn't it?
Yes.
And why should that be for people who don't understand that? Why should it be that being on Instagram makes you feel bad about the way your body looks?
Facebook's own reports say it is not just that Instagram is dangerous for teenagers. It is actually more dangerous than other forms of social media, because
Why?
TikTok is about doing fun activities with your friends. It's about performance. Snapchat is about faces and like augmented reality. Reddit is at least vaguely about ideas. But Instagram is about social comparison and about bodies, right? It is about like people's lifestyles, and that's what ends up being worse for kids. There's also an effect, which is a number of things are different about a life mediated by Instagram than what high school used to be like. So when I was in high school, it didn't matter if your experience at high school was horrible. Most kids had good homes to go home to. And they could, at the end of the day, disconnect. They would get a break for 16 hours. Facebook's own research says now the bullying follows children home. It goes into their bedrooms. The last thing they see at night is someone being cruel to them. The first thing they see in the morning is a hateful statement. And that is just so much worse.
So they don't get a moment's peace.
They don't get a moment's peace.
If you're being bullied all the time.
Yeah.
Now, you've already told the Senate, and you've also told us what Facebook could do to make to address some of these issues, but some of your answers were quite complicated.
Oh no, sorry.
So perhaps you could tell us in a really simple way that anybody can get what Facebook could do to address those issues. Children who want to kill themselves, children who are being bullied, children who are obsessed with their body image in an unhealthy way, and all the other issues that you've addressed. But what is it that Facebook can do now, without difficulty, to solve those issues?
There are a number of factors that interplay that drive those issues. On a most basic level, children don't have as good self-regulation as adults do. That's why they're not allowed to buy cigarettes. When kids describe their usage of Instagram, Facebook's own research describes it as an addict's narrative. As an addict's narrative. The kids say, this makes me unhappy. I feel like I don't have the ability to control my usage of it. And I feel that if I left, I'd be ostracized. I am deeply worried that it may not be possible to make Instagram safe for a 14-year-old, and I sincerely doubt it's possible to make it safe for a 10-year-old.
So they shouldn't be on it?
I would be surprised. I would love to see a proposal from an established independent agency that had a picture of what a safe version of Instagram for a 14-year-old looks like.
But you don't think such a thing exists?
I am not aware of something that
Does Facebook care whether or not Instagram is safe for a 10-year-old?
What I find very deeply misleading about Facebook's statements regarding children is they say things like, we need Instagram kids because kids are going to lie about their age, and so we might as well have a safe thing for them. Facebook should have to publish what they do to detect 13-year-olds on the platform, because I guarantee you what they're doing today is not enough. And Facebook's own research does something where Facebook can guess how old you are with a great deal of precision, because they can look at who your friends are, who you interact with.
Because you're at school.
Yeah, because
that's a bit of a giveaway.
Oh,
if you're
yeah.
wearing a school uniform,
Yes.
chances are you're on 20.
But I want to disclose a very specific thing. This is something actually the Senate found when we disclosed the documents to them. They found that Facebook had estimated the ages of teenagers and worked backwards to figure out how many kids lied about their ages and how many were on the platform. And they found for some cohorts 10 to 15%. 10 to 15% of 10-year-olds were on the platform. Facebook should have to publish those stats every year so we can grade how good were they at keeping kids off the platform.
Right. So Facebook can solve this if it wants to do so.
Facebook can make a huge dent on this if they wanted to, and they don't because they know that young users are the future of the platform, and the earlier they get them, the more likely they'll get them hooked.
Okay, and obviously young users are no different from the rest of us. They're also getting to see all the disinformation about COVID and everything else that the rest of us are getting to see. And just remind us what percentage of disinformation is being taken down by Facebook.
I actually don't know that stat off the top of my head.
Well, I believe it's, from what I understand, it's 3 to 5%.
Oh, that's for hate speech.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it's approximately the same.
Well, I would guess so.
It's probably even less from the perspective of the only information that is false at Facebook is information that has been verified by a third-party fact-checking system. And that can only catch viral misinformation. So that's misinformation that goes to 500,000, 1 million people. And this is the most important thing for the UK. I don't believe there's anywhere near as much third-party fact-checking coverage for the UK compared to the United States.
Okay. And the wonders of texting tell me that actually the figure is 10 to 20% for disinformation. Yes, so I stand corrected, 10 to 20% for disinformation and 3 to 5% for hate speech. So a vast amount of disinformation and hate speech is getting through to children, which must present children with a very peculiar, jaundiced sense of the world. And we have absolutely no idea, do we, how those children are going to grow up and change and develop and mature, having lived in this very poisonous society at this very delicate stage in their development.
I'm extremely worried about the developmental impacts of Instagram on children. Beyond the fact that if you get an eating disorder when you're 16, you may have osteoporosis for the rest of your life, right? There are going to be women who are walking around this earth in 60 years with brittle bones because of choices Facebook made now. But I think the secondary thing that I'm super scared about is kids are learning that people they care about treat them cruelly. Because kids on Instagram, when they were moved with the feedback of watching someone cry or watching someone wince, they're much more hateful, they're much meaner to people, even who are their friends. Imagine what the domestic relationships will be like for those kids when they're 30 if they learn that people who care about them are mean to them.
It's a very disturbing thought. And the other very disturbing thing that you've told us about, which I think most people haven't focused on, is the idea that language matters. So we think Facebook is bad now, but what we don't tend to realise in our very Anglocentric culture is that all the other languages around the world are getting no moderation of any kind at all.
I think the thing that should scare you even more living in the UK is the UK is a diverse society. Those languages aren't happening abstractly in Africa and getting the raw, dangerous version of Facebook. A version of Facebook that Mark has said himself is dangerous. Engagement-based ranking is dangerous without AI. That's what Mark Zuckerberg said. Those people are also living in the UK and being fed misinformation that is dangerous, that radicalizes people. And so language-based coverage is not just a good for individuals thing, it is a national security issue.
That's interesting. You, on the social front, you pointed out that there might be differences between the United Kingdom and the United States, which it's not picking up, and I've said this to the committee before, but I've got personal experience of this in Twitter, where I'm a gay man, and I was called a greasy bender on Twitter, and I reported it to Twitter, and Twitter wrote back and told me that there was nothing wrong with being called a greasy bender. And then I wrote back giving the exact chapter and verse from their community standards, which showed it was unacceptable, and somebody wrote back to me, presumably from California, telling me that it was absolutely acceptable. Now, to be generous, it may just be that they didn't know what a bender was, because it's not in use in the United States. But honestly, I think I'd have Googled if I'd been them, just to find out why this MP was being so persistent about this particular word. In a nutshell, what do you want us to do in this case? What's the most useful thing in addressing the concerns that you've raised here?
I think forcing Facebook, so I want to be clear, bad actors have already tested Facebook. They've gone and tried to hit the rate limits. They've tried experiments with content. They know Facebook's limitations. The only one who doesn't know Facebook's limitation are good actors. Facebook needs to disclose what its integrity systems are and which languages they work in, and the performance per language or per dialect. Because I guarantee you the safety systems that are designed for English probably don't work as well on UK English versus American English.
All of this makes Facebook sound relatively benign, doesn't it? As if it's just not doing quite what it should be doing. But what your evidence has shown to us is that Facebook is failing to prevent harm to children. It's failing to prevent the spread of disinformation. It's failing to present hate speak. It does have the power to deal with these issues. It's just choosing not to, which makes me wonder whether Facebook is just fundamentally evil. Is Facebook evil?
I cannot see into the hearts of men. And I think there is a real thing of people, good people, and Facebook is overwhelmingly full of conscientious, kind, empathetic people.
You have to leave.
Good people who are embedded in systems with bad incentives are led to bad actions. And there is a real pattern of people who are willing to look the other way are promoted more than people who raise alarms.
We know where that leads in history,
Yeah.
don't we? So could we compromise that it's not evil? Maybe that's an overly moralistic word. But the way that some of the outcomes of Facebook's behaviour is evil.
I think it's negligent.
Malevolent?
Malevolent implies intent, and I cannot see into the hearts of men. But I do believe there is a pattern of inadequacy, that Facebook is unwilling to acknowledge its own power. It believes in a world of flatness, which hides the difference, like children are not adults, right? They believe in flatness, and they won't accept the consequences of their actions. And so I think that is negligence, and it is ignorance. But I can't see into their hearts, and so I don't want to consider it malevolent.
Well, I respect your desire, obviously, to answer the question in your own way. But given the evidence that you've given us, I think a reasonable person running Facebook, seeing the consequences of the company's behaviour, would, I imagine, have to conclude that what they were doing, the way their company was performing, and the outcomes were malevolent and would want to do something about it.
I would certainly hope so.
Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just on that point about...
Would you mind if I rested my voice for 5 minutes? Just, could we take a break for a second? Or we... Oh, sorry. I don't know how long we're going to go. So if we go for 2.5 hours, I'll never mind. Ask your question.
Okay, thank you.
We'll do it after.
Just on that point about intent, I mean, someone may not have intended to do a bad thing, but if their actions are causing that, and they're told about it, and they don't change their strategy, then what do you say about them then?
I am a big proponent of we need to look at systems and how systems perform, and this idea that, and actually this is a huge problem inside of Facebook. Facebook has this philosophy that they can, if they establish the right metrics, they can allow people free reign, right? They, like I said, they're intoxicated by flatness. They have the largest open floor plan office in the world. It's 1/4 of a mile long in one room, right? They believe in flatness. They believe that if you pick a metric, you can let people do whatever they want to move that metric. And that's all you have to do. If you had better metrics, you could do better actions. But that ignores that if you learn data that metric is leading to harm, which is what meaningful social interactions did, that the metric can get embedded. Because now there are thousands of people who are all trying to move a metric, and people get scared to change a metric and make people not get their bonuses. And so I think there is a real thing of there is no will at the top. Mark Zuckerberg has unilateral control over 3 billion people, right? There's no will at the top to make sure these systems are run in an adequately safe way. And I think until we bring in a counterweight, things will be operated for the shareholders' interest and not for the public interest.
Thank you. Joining us remotely, Dean Russell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for joining us today. It's incredibly important, and your testimony has been heard loud and clear. The points I want to just pick up on was about addiction. If Facebook were optimizing algorithms in the same way, or viewed to be doing it in the same way as a drug company was trying to improve addiction of their product, it would probably be viewed very differently. And I just wondered if you could explore a bit further this role of addiction and whether actually Facebook is doing something that we perhaps have never seen in history before, which is creating an addictive product that perhaps isn't consumed, but actually through taking the drug, as it were, but is consumed via a screen.
Inside of Facebook, there are many euphemisms that are meant to hide the emotional impact of things. So, for example, the ethnic violence team is called the social cohesion team, because ethnic violence is what happens when social cohesion breaks down. For addiction, the metaphor is problematic use. People are not addicted, they have problematic use. The reality is that using large-scale studies, so these are 100,000 people, Facebook has found that problematic use is much worse in young people than people who are older. So the bar for problematic use is that you have to be self-aware enough and honest enough with yourself to admit that you don't have control over your usage and that it is harming your physical health, your school, or your employment. And for 14-year-olds, it peaks. You know, their first year, they haven't gotten quite enough problematic use yet, but by the time they get to be 14, between 5.8% and 8% of kids say they have problematic use. And that's a huge problem. If that many 14-year-olds are that self-aware and that honest, the real number is probably 15, 20%. I am deeply concerned about Facebook's role in hurting the most vulnerable among us. Facebook has studied who has been most exposed to misinformation, and it is people who have been recently widowed, people who are recently divorced, people who moved to a new city, people who are socially isolated. And I am deeply concerned that they have made a product that can lead people away from their real communities and isolate them in these rabbit holes, in these filter bubbles. Because what you find is that when people are sent targeted misinformation to a community, it can make it hard to reintegrate into larger society because now you don't have shared facts. So that's the real harm. I like to talk about the idea of the misinformation burden instead of thinking of it as, because it is a burden when we encounter this kind of information. Facebook right now doesn't have any disincentive for trying to do high quality, shorter sessions. Imagine if there was a syntax that was a penny an hour, right? So this is like dollars a year for Facebook per user. Imagine if there was a syntax that pushed Facebook to have shorter sessions that were higher quality. Nothing today is incentivizing them to do this. All the incentives say, if you can get them to stay on the platform longer, you'll get more ad revenue, you'll make more money.
And so with that, and thank you, that's very helpful. But in terms of the way that often the discussion is around the bill, especially that we're looking at, the online safety bill, is around the comparison with it being a publisher or publishing platform. But should we be looking at this much more about almost a product approach, which in essence is causing addiction, as you say, with young people? And as you mentioned earlier about the impact on, trying to get a greater high almost through the dopamine in their brain. So we've heard previous testimony from experts highlighting that actually children's brains seem to be changing because they're using Facebook and other platforms to a large extent over many, many hours. And if they were being given a white powder and they were having the same symptoms, the same outputs, we'd be very quick to clamp down on that. But because it's via a screen and we call it Facebook and we think everyone's using it nicely, that doesn't happen. So I'd just be interested in your view on the impact on children, whether Facebook have actually been looking at that, but also whether we should be doing this almost with regards to Facebook being a product rather than a platform.
I find it really telling that if you go to Silicon Valley and you look at the most elite private schools, they often have zero social media policies, that they try to establish cultures where you don't use phones and you don't connect with each other on social media. The fact that is a trend in the most elite private schools in Silicon Valley, I think should be a warning to us all. It is super scary to me that we are not taking a safety first perspective with regard to children, right? Safety by design is so essential with kids because the burden that we've set up till now is the idea that the public has to prove to Facebook that Facebook is dangerous. Facebook has never had to prove that their product is safe for children, right? And we need to flip that script. With pharmaceuticals, a long time ago we said it's not the obligation of the public to say this medicine is dangerous, it's the obligation of the producer to say this medicine is safe. We've done this over and over again, and this is the right moment to act. This is the moment to change that relationship with the public.
And if I may, just on that point, sorry, my screen seems to be switching off. My apologies. With regards to that point of addiction, have there been any studies from your awareness within Facebook and within the documents you've seen where they have actually looked at how they can increase addiction via the algorithms?
I have not seen any documents that are as explicit as saying Facebook is trying to make addiction worse, but I have seen documents where on one side someone's saying the number of sessions per day that someone has, like the number of times they visit Facebook, is indicative of their risk of exhibiting problematic use. But on the other side, they're clearly not talking to each other. Someone says, interesting, an indicator that people will still be on the platform in 3 months is if they have more sessions every day. We should figure out how to drive more sessions. And this is an example of Facebook is not, because their management style is flat, there isn't enough cross-promotion. There's not enough cross-filtration. And the side that is responsible for growing the company is often is kept away from the side that highlights harms. And that kind of world where it's not integrated, that causes dangers and it makes the problem worse.
Thank you. Sorry, Dave, we can pause there. It's 25 to 2. We're going for over an hour, so I think we'll take a 10-minute break at this point.
That'd be lovely.
Thank you
So much.